Everyone goes,
Order.
Cybersecurity and Resilience, Network and Information Systems Bill.
Good morning, everyone. We're now sitting in public and the proceedings are being broadcast. Before we begin, I would like to remind members to switch electronic devices to silent, please. Tea and coffee not to be allowed during the sittings. Today we will first consider the programme motion on the amendment paper. We will then consider a motion to enable the reporting of written evidence of publication and a motion to allow us to deliberate in private about our questions before the oral evidence sessions. In view of the time available, I hope we can take these matters formally without debate. I first call the Minister to move the programme motion standing in his name, which was discussed yesterday by the programming subcommittee for this bill.
to move.
The question is a programme motion on the amendment paper. As many of that opinion say aye.
Aye.
To the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. I call the Minister to move the motion about written evidence.
To move.
The question is the motion on the amendment paper. As many as of that opinion say aye. To the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Copies of written evidence received by the committee will be made available in the committee room. I now call the Minister to move the motion about deliberating in private. As many as of that opinion say aye. To the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. We now go into private session to discuss lines of questioning.
In Parliament.
Right. Okay. Well, thank you. Thank you. That is duly declared. Order. We're now sitting in public again, and we've heard declarations of interest. If there are any others, please say no. Good. We're now going to hear oral evidence from Jan Ellis, Associate Fellow for Cyber and Tech at RUSI, who's joining us online. Hello, Jan. Welcome.
Morning.
And David Cook, who is a partner at DLA Piper. David, good morning. Thank you for coming. Before calling the first member to ask a question, I remind members that questions should be limited to matters within the scope of the bill. We must stick to the timings as a programme motion that the committee has agreed to, and for this session we have until 10 a.m. I call the Shadow Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Chen. Thanks, Jen and David, for coming to give evidence to us this morning. Two questions. Firstly, one to you, Jen, to start off with. Under the bill as drafted, lots of UK corporations have been the subject of recent major cyber attacks, so JLR, M&S. these remain outside the scope of the regulation. In your view, what's the best way to mitigate the risk to the economy, jobs and supply chains of further cyber attacks of this scale to these important out-of-scope businesses? And sort of slightly linked to that, Mr. Cook, what lessons have you learned from assisting clients with the implementation of NIS2 on the need for certainty in legislation, and what do you think will be the most challenging areas for business to implement of this bill? Thank you.
Thank you. Shall I jump in first then? So there's a thing that you always hear people say in the cybersecurity industry, which is there are no silver bullets. There's no quick fix or one easy thing, and that definitely applies when you're looking at policy as well. So I can't give you a nice, easy, pat answer on how we solve the problem of attacks like the ones we saw last year. What I can say is that from the point of view of looking at CSRB specifically, I think that there could be an inclusion of companies above a certain size or impact to the UK economy, rather than going, the bill currently goes sector by sector, which it makes lots of sense to focus on essential services. But I think we could say that there is also this other bucket where organizations beyond a certain level of impact on the economy would also be covered. And that could be something like the FTSE 350 or something like that. And that might be one way to go about it, to have them be included. But it's also worth noting that it wouldn't just simply solve the problem, because the problem is complex and multifaceted. And this is just one piece of legislation. Thank you.
With respect to NIS2, that's an example of a whole suite of laws that have come in across the European Union. The Digital Decade Law, I think there's something like 10 or 15 of these new laws. They do all sorts of different things, and NIS2 sits within that. NIS2 being the reform of the NIS Directive, which is the current state of play in UK law. And NIS2 gives certainty and definition by way of the legislation itself, and then implementing legislation, which means that organisations have had a run-up at the issue and a wholesale governance programme which takes a number of years, but they know where they're headed because it's a fixed point in the distance on the horizon. On the other hand, the legislation that we're talking about today, the bill, has got the same framework as a base, and then the plan is that secondary legislation can be used in a much more agile way to introduce changes quickly in light of moving parts within the geopolitical ecosystem outside the walls. And for an organisation that's global, that has governance that spans jurisdictions, a lack of certainty is unhelpful. Understanding where they need to get to often requires a multi-year programme of reform. And so I can see the benefits of having an agile, flexible system, but organisations often need, especially global ones, which are the sort of organisations within scope of this law, need time to prepare, time to recruit people, get that skill set in place and understand where they need to get to. That fixed point in future needs to be defined.
Chris Vince.
Thank you, Chair. And I feel I should probably also declare an interest because I'm the constituent MP for Harlow, which just has a large data centre in it. So I think I should just mention that. My question really is about international alignment, and really just to understand if this legislation is in keeping with developments that you are seeing globally, really.
David, do you want to go first and I'll come in after?
Absolutely. But there's reform all over the world. At its core, we've got a European law which is transposed into UK national legislation, the General Data Protection Regulation, which talks about personal data. And that's been seen as the gold standard all over the world. And so different jurisdictions have implemented not quite a copycat law, but one that looks a lot like the GDPR. So organisations have got something they can target, and then within their territory, they're often going to hit a compliance threshold as well. Because of changes in the geopolitical environment, we're seeing for example, in Europe, but then also in Australia and in the US, specific laws that come in that look at supply chain and look at different sectors and provide for more onerous obligations. So we're seeing that in the environment. NIS2 is being transposed into national laws. Organisations take a long time to get to the point of compliance. I think we're probably behind the curve, but this is not a new concept. Adapting to change within tech and change within how organisations themselves are relying on a supply chain that is more vulnerable and fragile, I think is common.
Thank you.
Bradley Thomas.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Just picking up on the back of what Jen mentioned about FTSE and publicly traded companies being within scope, is there a view on privately owned companies that may be of a particular scale to ensure that they're within scope? And if so, do you have a view on how you would determine that? Might it be based on things like turnover, number of employees, or it could be some other identifiable characteristic?
Yeah, for sure. I don't think it should come down to whether you're public or private, right? I think it should be about impact. I think figuring out how to measure that is challenging. And I will say, I will leave that problem with policymakers, and you're welcome. But I don't think it's about number of employees. I think we have to think about impact in a much more pragmatic way. That, in the tech sector, you can have relatively small companies that have very profound impact because they happen to be the thing that's used by everybody, and that's actually part of the problem with security, is that you have small teams running things that get used very ubiquitously. So I think we have to think a little bit differently about this. We've seen in recent years outages that are not necessarily maliciously driven, but they have demonstrated to us how reliant we are on technology and how widespread impact can be. Even just something like a local MSP that happens to provide managed services for a whole region's local government in Germany. They went down and it knocked out all local services for some period of time. So I do think, yes, you are absolutely right. We should be looking at the private sector as well, privately held companies as well. And we should be thinking about impact, but measuring impact and figuring out who's in scope and who isn't will be really challenging. And we'll have to start looking down the supply chain, whereas it gets a lot more complex.
Thank you. I'm looking around the table. Yes, please. Tim Rocker.
Thank you, Chair. Mainly for Jen, your colleague Jamie McColl has made a series of quite forthright comments about the bill and comparing it to NIS2. I mean, how does this legislation compare to legislation worldwide in your view?
So just as a starting point, I'll just clarify that I'm a fellow at RUSI, and I do work closely with Jamie, but I do not work for RUSI. Just to be clear, I also take no responsibility for Jamie's comments. But in terms of the comparisons, David alluded to the fact that Europe is a little bit ahead of us. The NIS2, so their update to NIS, came into force 3 years ago, with a sort of dangling timeline in that nations had until October 2024 to implement it. And my understanding is that not everybody's implemented it amazingly effectively as yet, right? So there is some lag there across the member states. I think in terms of what NIS2 includes, I don't think we're too out of scope of that, although I will say that we're talking about primary legislation right now. A lot of the detail will be in the secondary legislation. And so we don't necessarily know exactly how those two things will line up against each other. And I also think that the UK seems to be taking a bit of a different approach of where the EU has very specifically tried to make this as clearly mandated detail as possible, because they want all the member states to adopt the same basis of requirements, which is different to how NIS1 was. Whereas in the UK, it seems as though we want to provide a little bit of flexibility for the regulators to kind of choose their own adventure. I'm not sure that is necessarily the best approach. I think we might end up with a pretty disparate set of experiences. And that might be really confusing for organizations that are covered by more than one competent authority. But I think in terms of like the main things that NIS2 and CSRB are looking at, they're pretty aligned, to be honest. You know, there is a lot of focus on the same things. It's sort of expanding scope to make sure we're keeping up with what we believe Essential now looks at. There's a lot of focus on increased incident reporting and information sharing. And again, the devil will be in the detail in the secondary legislation. The other thing I would say, though, and this goes back to the question earlier on about what's happening internationally, I think when you look at the nations that David mentioned, like Australia, if you look at the jurisdiction around the EU, one of the things that they're doing, they're really proactive on cyber policy, as is the UK. They are taking a really holistic view. David alluded to this in his intro, and they are really looking at how all of the pieces fit together. I'm not sure that it's always super clear that the UK is doing the same. I think there is an effort to do the same, and I think UK policymakers are very proactive on cyber policy and are looking at different areas to work on. But that view of how it all goes together may not be as clear. And I think one area where we're definitely behind is legislating around vendor behavior and what we expect from the people who are actually making and selling technology.
Minister.
Thank you, Chair. And thanks very much, both of you, for your insights today. The question in my mind is really related to this point in part, Jen, that you raised, which is that there are a range of levers at the disposal of the government in thinking about and acting on cybersecurity. And I'm interested in your views on how you think about parts of the economy which ought to be in the scope of regulation and legislative measures, and also effective measures that sit outside of regulation and legislation, a range of non-regulatory measures, where guidance being one of them, where those are better suited as well.
Again, it's a hugely complex question to cover in a short amount of time. I think one of the challenges we face in the UK is that we are a 99% small to mediums economy. And it is hard to think about how to place more burden on small to medium businesses, what they can reasonably get done, and what the resources are that are available. That said, that's the problem we have to deal with. We have to figure out how to make progress. I think there is also a challenge here where we tend to focus a lot on the behavior of the victim, and it's understandable why. That is the side that we can control. But we are missing that middle piece, right? There is the bad guys who we can't control, but we can try and prosecute and bring to task. There are the victims who we are able to control, and we have a lot of focus on that. CSRB focuses on that side. And then there's this sort of middle ground of, I would say, kind of enablers, right? And they're not intending to be enablers, but they are the people who are creating the platforms, the mediums, the technology. And I'm not sure that we are where we could be in thinking about how to really set a baseline for them. We have a lot of voluntary codes, and that's fantastic, really good starting point. But you know what the value of voluntary is, right? And how much it requires behavioral change. And I think what you see is the organizations that are already doing well and taking security seriously are following the voluntary codes because they were already investing. There's a really long tail of organizations that aren't. And I also think that, with any policy approach, whether it's legislation or other, it all comes down to, you can build the best thing in the world. If you don't have a plan for adoption and you don't have a plan for that engagement piece of like what it really looks like to go into communities, to see how people are wrestling with this stuff, to see what the challenges are that are blocking adoption, to think about how to address those challenges and remove them. And also, where necessary, to make sure you've got appropriate enforcement, accountability, and transparency. And I think that's really critical. And I'm not sure that we see a huge amount of that at the moment. So I think that's an area where there is potential for growth. And I think with CSRB, that piece around enforcement is going to be really critical, not just of the covered entities, but also, we're giving new authorities to the regulators. What are we doing to say to the regulators? And we expect you to use them, and we expect you to be accountable for using them and to demonstrate that your sector is improving. So I think there needs to be sort of stronger conversations about what it looks like to not meet the requirements. And I do think we should be looking more broadly beyond just telling small companies that they need to do more. And if we are going to tell small companies to do more, how do we make it so that that's the thing that they can prioritize and that they care about and that they take seriously, the same way that, I guess, health and safety is taken seriously?
I think just to follow up on that, to achieve the outcome in question, which is about supply chain criticality, and where smaller entities are also relying on that supply chain, I think rather than, I can see the benefit of bringing those small entities within scope, but rather than that approach, it could be that there's something more forthright in the legislation around how the supply chain is dealt with from a contractual basis. So what we see in reality is when organisations that are a smaller entity try and contract with a much larger entity, an IT outsource provider, for example, they may find pushback if the contractual terms that they're asking for are not required in the legislation. They just help that entity if they're in place. And so where an organisation can rely on the GDPR, which has very specific requirements as to what that contract should contain, or DORA, so a European financial services piece of law, very prescriptive in what a contract must contain. Any kind of entity doing deals, entering into a contract, can't really push back on that because the requirements are there and set out in stone. What we don't have in the bill is a similar sort of requirements as to what a contract with these providers might look like. And so pushing that requirement into a negotiation between a much smaller entity and a massive global IT outsource provider, by way of example, means that we're going to see either piecemeal clauses, which don't always achieve the outcomes you're after, or we're going to see that those clauses are not in place at all because of a commercial reality. I think that having a similarly prescriptive set of requirements as to what that contract would contain means that anybody negotiating could point to the law and say, we have to have this in place, and there's no wriggle room, which I think would achieve the outcome you're after, which is those smaller entities would all have those identical contracts, at least as a baseline, in place.
Lee Darlington.
Thank you, Chair. I just wanted to go back a little bit to basics and get a bit of insight from you of what is the cyber risk that businesses are currently facing and how you feel the proposed bill is actually addressing those actual risks.
The original NIS regulations came out of a directive from 2016, so this is 10 years old now. And the world changes quickly, especially when it comes to technology. So this supply chain vulnerability is something which is not only systemic, but one which causes a significant risk to UK businesses, but global businesses as well. Because ransomware groups or threat actors or cyber criminals, however you want to badge that, are looking for a one-to-many model. Rather than go after each organisation piecemeal, if they can find a route through one organisation that leads to millions, they're always going to follow it. And so at the moment, they're out of scope. And the reality is, firstly, those organisations are global in nature and often perhaps don't pay due regard for UK law because they're acting all over the world and we're one of many jurisdictions. But also we're seeing that they allow, because they are the threat vector that's allowing an attack into an organisation, and it then sits with the organisations who are attacked to deal with the fallout. Often they don't get away scot-free, but they're outside of legislative scrutiny and kind of carry on operating as they were before. So that is causing a vulnerability. The one-to-many attack route is a vulnerability, but then also how the law is equipped to deal with the fallout of that is also something which is at the moment lacking.
I'll just, I just add to that, just in terms of like what the landscape looks like and what we're talking about here. I think we have a huge focus often in our dialogue around cybercrime, and we look a lot at things like data protection and that kind of thing. Last year, we saw the impact of disruptive-based attacks, but we've also in the past few years heard a lot more about state-sponsored attacks. And, I don't know how familiar everyone in the room is with Volt Typhoon, Salt Typhoon. These are, widespread nation-state attacks that were uncovered in the US. We are not immune to such attacks, right? We could be just as easily victim to these kinds of attacks. And what I think we should take the discovery of Volt Typhoon as is a massive wake-up call that we are aware of the challenge, but we're not moving fast enough to address the challenge. And Volt Typhoon particularly targeted US critical infrastructure with a view to basically being able to massively disrupt it at scale should a reason to do so come into place, right? We cannot look at that level of disruption across our society. The impact of it would be catastrophic. So I think part of what NIS is doing, what CSRB is looking to do, is take NIS and update it, yes, to make sure it's covering the relevant things. But I also hope that what we'll see is a new level of urgency and understanding that these risks are very prevalent. They are coming from all different sources with all sorts of different motivations. There is huge complexity, which David has spoken to, around the supply chain. And we really need to see the critical infrastructure, the core service providers become hugely more vigilant and really take their role as providers of a critical service very seriously when it comes to security, to think about, like, what are they doing to be part of the solution of trying to harden and protect the UK against outside interference.
By way of example, if I may, NIS 1 talks about reporting to the regulator if there's a significant impact caused. And what we're seeing with some of the sorts of attacks that Jen has spoken about is pre-positioning. So a criminal or a threat actor sits on the network and the environment and waits for the day in which they're going to push the big red button and cause an attack. Well, that's outside of NIS 1. If that sort of issue was identified, it wouldn't be reportable to the regulator. Therefore, the regulator wouldn't have any visibility of that. NIS 2 and the bill talks about if something's identified which is caused by or is capable of causing severe operational disruption. So it widens the ambit of visibility and allows the UK state, as well as regulators, understand what's going on within the environment more broadly, because if there are trends, if a number of organisations report to a regulator that they have found this pre-positioning, they know that a malicious actor is planning on something, that the footprints are there.
Freddie Van Mierlo.
Thank you, Chair. I just wanted to also take a bit of a step back and sort of ask a broader question as to why this legislation is necessary. As in, obviously, I think we agree it is, but why aren't companies already adhering to very high cybersecurity standards? As in, surely it is within their interest, their commercial interest, to do so. We've seen the massive impact of failing to do so last year, with impacts on JLR, on M&S, on the co-op. So why might the state mandating companies to be cyber secure and make them cyber secure?
So I think you covered a lot of territory there, and I'm going to try and break it into pieces a little bit. Because I think actually, if you look at the attacks of last year, all of the companies you mentioned were investing in cybersecurity. I think there's a difficulty here where there is no such thing as being bulletproof or being secure. And what you're trying to do is you're trying to always raise the barriers as high as you can, make it harder for attackers to be successful. The 3 attacks you mentioned were highly targeted attacks. The example we just talked to, Revolt Typhoon in the US, highly targeted attacks. These are attackers who are highly motivated to go after specific entities and are going to keep going until they get somewhere. It's really hard to defend against stuff like that. And I think what you're trying to do is remove the chances of all the opportunistic stuff happening, right? That said, so one, we're not going to become secure as such, but we're trying to really, really minimize the risk as much as we possibly can. 2, it's really complex to do it. And we saw last year with the examples of companies who had invested that even though they'd invested, they still missed some things. And even things like the discussions they'd had around cyber insurance, they had massively underestimated what the cost would be of the level of disruption they experienced. So part of it is also that we're still trying to figure out how things are going to happen, what the impacts will be, what that looks like in the long term. The other thing I will say, though, in terms of companies, because there is a long tail of companies that aren't investing or aren't investing enough, and this legislation will hopefully help with that. But I think more importantly, what you want to see is you want to see regulators engaging on the issue and talking to their covered entities and really going on a journey with them to understand what the risks are and understand where they need to get to. When you're talking about critical providers, when you're talking about essential services, it is really hard for an organization perhaps in their minds or answerable to their board or answerable to their investors to justify spend on cybersecurity. If you're a hospital, to say we're putting money to security programs rather than to beds or to diagnostics is an incredibly difficult conversation to have. And I think one of the good things about CSRB is that it will hopefully legitimize those conversations and those choices and say, actually, investing time and resources into cybersecurity is investing time and resources into providing a critical essential service. And it's okay to make those payoff choices. They have to be made. So I think part of it is that it is so hard when you are running an organization to think about all the different elements. And the problem as well with cybersecurity, and something we need to be clear on, is with a lot of things that we ask organizations to do, we kind of go to them and we're like, you have to make this investment to get to this point, and then you move on. So they might take a loan, or the government might help them in some way, or they might deprioritize other spending for a set period of time so that they can go invest in the thing, getting up to date on something or building out something. And then they're sort of done and they can move back to a normal sort of operating state. Security isn't that. It is expensive, it is complex, it is multifaceted. We're asking organizations of all sizes, many of whom are not large in the UK, and we're asking them to invest, and we're asking them to invest in perpetuity, and we're asking them to increase investment over time and build maturity. That is not a small ask. And so I think we do need to understand that there are like very reasonable dynamics at play here of why we're not where we need to be. But at the same time, we need to see a lot more urgency and a lot more focus. And so getting the regulators engaged, getting them to prioritize this, having them work with their sectors to bring their sectors along and build that maturity, and legitimizing the investment of time and resources for critical infrastructure, I think is really important.
Thank you, Chair. Both of you have mentioned supply chains previously and the risk involved in them. Do you think that outside of regulated industries, this bill goes far enough to secure supply chains? And if not, what would your recommendations be?
The legislation talks about secondary legislation. So it allows for an agile, flexible program whereby organisations can be brought within scope very quickly if necessary because of concerns. Now, what that leaves us with, though, whilst legislation can be changed quickly, organisations often can't. So where there's definition, as we see with NIS2, as to which entities are within scope, organisations can embark on a multi-year programme to get into a compliant position. They can throw money at it effectively. What this legislation talks about through the secondary legislation thing is bringing organisations into scope and mandating specific security controls or specific requirements on that organisation in terms of security, which, whilst the law might come in over a weekend, actually that organisational change won't necessarily follow. So I think there's a potential issue there, and I can see the benefit, the attractiveness of why secondary legislation could be used to achieve that aim, but having a more clear baseline as to what that sort of scope might look like, and it can be ramped up or down, the volume can be turned up or down depending on need, I think would be more helpful. So reducing scope whilst diverging from NIS2 might be a benefit in terms of the commercial reality. I think in terms of security and the long tail that it takes to get more secure, actually I think might be a misstep.
Thank you. I'm going to bring Alison Gardner in now. Because
a quick question. You mentioned vulnerabilities earlier, and you mentioned, Jen, the complexities of implementing cybersecurity plans. And, of course, human factors, and not least of which the lack of skills, play a key role in cyber resilience, as well as technological factors. How would or could the bill address the human element in cybersecurity?
That's a great question, and it is a tricky one. We talk a lot about sort of training and security awareness, and I think unfortunately it becomes just yet another tick box. You know, you kind of start a job and you watch your sexual harassment training video, and then you watch your cybersecurity training video, and probably the former sticks with you better than the latter. And I think we have to change that, right? I think we have to change that dynamic. What I think, again, I'll kind of go a little bit back to my last answer, which is I think one of the strengths of the bill is that it will hopefully enable the regulators to engage much more on this topic, and therefore to engage their covered entities much more. And I think that's what we need to see. We need to see leadership in organizations engage with the topic of cybersecurity, not as a chore or as a tick box exercise or that headline they read about JLR, but actually as something that matters to their organization and something that they are going to engage with on a board level and executive team level, all the way down through the organization. Cultural change comes from the top typically, and we do need to see that level of change. So I hope, you know, I don't think there's anything specific in the legislation as it's currently written that says, and this in flashing lights is going to change the human factors piece. I think the devil it will come down to the detail in that, in the secondary legislation, and then what the regulators specifically ask for. But I think there does need to be a general shift in culture where, as sectors generally, we start to talk about this more as a requirement. You know, the financial services sector have talked about security for a long time. It's been a reality for them. I'm not sure how much that's true at sort of a breadth in something like, for example, the water industry. And I hope that will change. I hope that we will start to see it become more of a cultural norm to have those conversations at the top levels and then all the way down. And I think over time, and unfortunately you don't create cultural change quickly, and you know, when it comes to talking about human factors, it is about people becoming much more aware of it, thinking about it more. That will take time.
Thank you very much. I'm going to have to cut you off there.
Sorry for being too long.
No, you've been brilliant. That brings us to the end of the time allotted for the committee to ask questions. On behalf of the committee, can I thank you both for sparing time in your busy schedules this morning to give evidence.
Thank you.
Thank you.
To move to the next session.
You managed to get Harlow in on a declaration of interest. You know that, did you?
Engaging product placement. We should have a bingo card each day. That's what we can.
Okay,
and Harlow will definitely be on there.
I'll do it.
Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome. We're now going to hear oral evidence from Jill Broom, Head of Cyber Resilience at techUK, Stuart McKean, Chairman of 923, and Dr. Sanjana Mehta, Senior Director for Advocacy at ISC2. We must stick to timings, colleagues, in this programme motion that the committee has agreed for the session. We have until 10:40 a.m. Could the witnesses please briefly introduce themselves for the record? Dr. Mehta.
Good morning. My name is Sanjana and I work as Senior Director Advocacy at ISC2.
Good morning. My name is Jill Broom and I'm Head of Cyber Resilience at techUK, which is a trade association for the technology industry in the UK.
Good morning. I'm Stuart McKean. I'm the founder and chairman of 923. We're a small MSP based in the UK.
Hello, Minister, to kick off.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you for coming in and giving evidence to us this morning. So the bill wouldn't have prevented recent attacks on high-profile UK industries such as Co-op, Marks and Sparks and Jaguar Land Rover. What more do you think can be done to mitigate the risk to jobs, supply chains and the UK economy of further large-scale cyber attacks against these out-of-scope companies? And then my second question, which is a bit more technical, which is, do you consider that the definition of a managed service provider in this bill is sufficiently clear and certain for businesses to understand whether they are in scope or out of scope to this bill?
So I appear before the committee today on behalf of ISC2, which is the world's largest not-for-profit membership association for cybersecurity professionals. We have 265,000 members around the world and 10,000 plus members in the UK. Regarding your question about sectoral scope, so our central message is that we welcome the introduction of this bill and we believe that it is going to go a long way in improving the cyber resilience of the UK PLC. Yes, there are certain sectors that are outside the scope, and we believe that there are a number of non-legislative measures that could be used to enhance the cybersecurity of those other industries and parts of the sector. I think particularly the forthcoming National Cyber Action Plan should be used as a delivery vehicle for improving the resilience of the sector of the UK PLC as a whole. I think in the previous committee, there was Jen was mentioning that there are voluntary codes of practice that exist. Actually, as an organisation, we ourselves have piloted the code of practice for cyber governance, and we've signed up to the ambassador scheme on the code of practice for secure software development. We think that the upcoming National Cyber Action Plan can encourage the uptake of these schemes and frameworks further, But most importantly, as a non-legislative measure, we call upon government to focus on skills development, because ultimately that is going to be the key enabler of success, whether for organizations that are in scope of this bill or organizations that are outside the scope.
Could I say to the witnesses, don't feel obliged to answer every question. To colleagues, if they could perhaps direct their questions when they make them to individual witnesses, we'll get through quicker.
Well, if I just pick up on the MSP piece, I think it's quite broad at the moment. But I think adding some clarity to that will help. The key definition really with an MSP at the moment is based on size, and it's based on the EU, whether you're a small, medium, large, or even micro. The reality is that only, I think it's 11% of MSPs are going to be in scope in the bill, because they're going to be the large and medium-sized enterprises that are going to fall in scope as a managed service provider. So whilst the definition might be quite broad, the clarity on the size of MSP is actually quite particular, and actually you're going to lose a lot of MSPs won't be in scope.
I'd just like to add to that. While some of our members are content with the definition of managed service provider, others feel that, like Stuart said, it is too broad, and it continues to cause a little bit of confusion around, as it's likely to encompass virtually any IT service. So I think that probably some further work needs to be done, and there is some, further consultation. I think, there will be some further detail in secondary legislation around this, and that is probably one of the things that I just wanted to highlight, that a lot of the detail is coming in the secondary legislation, and that can make it quite difficult to, scrutinise the primary legislation. So a broad call out for ensuring mandatory and meaningful consultation on that secondary legislation and associated guidance would be really welcome. We are already working with the Bill team to put some of that kind of consultation engagement sessions in place, but I think we would call for that to be brought forward to help us understand some of that detail. It's currently estimated the consultation period on the secondary legislation to happen towards the end of the summer. We would like that to be brought forward where possible. It's also going to cover a lot of detail, so it needs to be, a substantial amount of time to be able to allow for us to comment back as well. And yes, we are keen to be involved in that process as much as possible.
Minister.
Thank you, Chair. And thank you all very much for making time. I have a implementation-focused question, perhaps directed at Stuart, but open to all, which is that in practice it'd be helpful to understand how frequent it is that a single company might provide multiple of the possible services in scope. So both MSP services, cloud hosting, data center support, but also cybersecurity services. And so the ability that we might have to be able to scope out parts of an organization that are in scope for particular bits, and those aren't.
Well, I think you're going to hear the word complex a lot today. It is hugely complex, and of course, everyone likes to, I'm going to say, dabble. Everyone has little bits of expertise, so certain that might be cloud focused, it might be tool sets, there's a whole range of skill sets, and of course, as you get into the larger organisations, they really do have multiple teams, multiple scope, they have much more credibility in operating in different areas. So actually, as that flows down the supply chain, it becomes, in a lot of cases, more difficult to really unpick the supply chain. So if, for example, if I'm a managed service provider and I'm delivering a cloud service from a US hyperscaler, who's then responsible? Am I, as the managed service provider, ultimately, on the hook? Yeah, I might be using a US-based hyperscaler, and not just to pick on the hyperscalers, by the way, but it could be a US software-based system that I'm using, a set of tools that I'm using. So there's a whole range of parts that need to become clearer, because otherwise you're going to start finding, certainly the managed services community are going to be saying, well, is that my responsibility? Do I have to deliver that? And then you're into the legislation side with procurement, because procurement will flow down. So whilst I might not be in scope directly as a small business, the reality is the primes, the government departments that are then funding all of that are going to flow those requirements down onto the smaller MSPs. So whilst we might not be in scope directly, when it comes to implementing and meeting the legislation, we will have to follow those rules.
Dr. Alison-Gardner.
It's quite interesting you mentioned the complexity. You also mentioned skilled teams, and Sanjana, you talked about the need for more skill, and responsibility and distributed responsibility across supply chains is a big deal. So bringing that down into sort of a duty care people of procuring these things, do you think that, because there has been found that annual cyber breach survey has found that declining levels of board level responsibility for cyber in recent years, so it has declined. So what explains this, and how could that be improved? And as a quick supplementary, do you think that it should be a statutory duty then for companies to have a board member responsible for cyber risk? And Jill, I'm going to go to you first on that one.
I think with the board, historically, cyber hasn't been viewed as a business risk. It's been viewed as a technical problem to be addressed by the technical teams. Instead of being a sort of valuable, fundamental enabler of your business, and also, kind of a commercial advantage as well, because you're secure and resilient. So I think that has been a problem historically, and it's about changing that culture and thinking about how we get the boards to think about this. I think there's a fair amount of work that's happening. I know the government has written to the FTSE 350 companies to ask them to put the cyber governance code of practice into play, and that is just to make sort of board level, cyber board level responsibility, and also to take account of things, like what they need to do in their supply chain.
Do you think there should be a statutory duty as to have a board member responsible?
I think that some of our members have pointed out that actually, the number of organisations that have cyber regulations that they need to, are under cyber regulations, it's very small, and it's only going to increase a smaller amount with the advent of this particular bill. Similarly, in the different jurisdictions, there are, kind of duties on boards to at the board level. So, there is an argument for it. I think the key thing is that we also need to be mindful of it being risk-based, and also that, there are organisations that could be disproportionately affected by this. So I think it needs a little bit more testing with our members as to whether a statutory requirement's needed.
Paddy Thomas.
Thank you, Chair. Two questions, if I can. The first one, just for a bit of context, I wonder if the witnesses can give us an idea of the objectives of cyber attacks. So are we seeing objectives based around disruption? Is it around extortion? Could be monetary or for intellectual property? And maybe a perspective on whether that differs depending on the origin of the organisation conducting the cyber attack. And then the second question is around the reporting model. So is there a view on whether this model proposed in the bill is beneficial, whether it risks sort of a fragmented approach, particularly if companies operate in a sector that is regulated by under the jurisdiction of two regulators? And do you think that a more universal, singular reporting model would be beneficial in ensuring a stronger response as possible?
May I weigh in on the second question first, please? So it is good to note that the definition for the reportable incident has expanded in the current legislation. I think one of the concerns that the post-implementation reviews had from the previous regulatory regime was that the regulated entities were underreporting, and we note that the bill has now expanded the definition to include incidents that could have an adverse impact on the security and operations of network and information systems, in addition to those incidents that are having or have had a negative impact. While that is clear on the one hand, and some factors have been provided, such as a number of customers affected, the geographical reach, and the duration of the incident, what is not clear at the moment is the thresholds linked with those factors. And in the absence of those thresholds, our concern is that organizations, regulated entities may be tempted to over-report rather than under-report, thereby creating more demands and efforts for the regulators. So we have to kind of think about regulatory capacity to actually deal with all the reports that are coming in through to them, but also to understand what might be the trade-offs on the regulated entities, particularly if an entity is regulated by more than one competent authority. It would mean reporting to those multiple authorities, particularly if that organization is a small, medium enterprise. There is a real concern that the trade-offs may result in procedural compliance over genuine cybersecurity resilience. So we call on government for more immediate clarification of the thresholds linked to those factors.
Just to come in on that as well, our members would agree with that too. The thing is that companies need to be clear on what needs to be reported, when it needs to be reported, and where they need to report it. So there's a bit of clarity that's required in that, certainly around definitions. As Sanjana said, it is good to see that it's expanding, but definitions such as, capable of having a significant impact remain unclear for industry, and therefore we need a little bit more clarity, because again that means that we could risk capturing absolutely everything that's out there, and we really want to focus on what is it that is most important that we need to be aware of. So determining materiality is really essential before making any report. Another thing as well is that in terms of the sort of where and the how, we are in favour of a single reporting platform as well, because that will reduce friction around the process, and it kind of allows businesses ultimately to know exactly where they're going. They don't need to report here for one regulator, there for another regulator. It is very sort of streamlined process, and it makes the regime as easy as possible to deal with, so it kind of helps incentivise people to actually act upon that. I think there's just another point to add around sequencing of alignment with other potential regulation here as well. We know that, for example, government's ransomware proposals include incident reporting requirements, and they are expected to come via a different legislative vehicle. I think we just need to be careful not to add any additional layers of complexity here, or other user journeys into an already complex landscape.
Thank you, Chair. I think my question's actually been answered. So
Excellent. Thank you. Freddie Van Miller.
Thank you, Chair. I've got two questions if that's okay. One to Jill and one to Dr. Sanjana. So first of all to Jill, what's your view on the relative strength of this legislation compared to what's coming forward in the EU? And do you think the fact that we're not following the EU will make it harder for your members to interact with, to trade with individuals, companies in Europe? And then secondly, a question. Earlier you spoke of what's not in scope in this legislation. I'm particularly interested in the fact that local government is not included in this legislation, and that they have a very critical role in electoral services, in local democracy, in national democracy. So what do you think the threats are there by leaving them out of scope?
I think that our members would always generally call for alignment where possible in any kind of legislation that spans the sort of geographies. But we understand that this is, focusing on a particular sector, the critical national infrastructure in the UK, and we welcome the intent of it.
On sectoral scope, so I think there are obviously, the way the bill is currently drafted, there's obviously flexibility to introduce new sectors, bring in more provisions and guidance through secondary legislation and additional guidance. That being said, our recommendation is certainly to expand the sectoral scope at this stage by bringing public administration in. There are a number of key reasons for that. Firstly, public administration needs to role model good cybersecurity to the rest of the economy. I think it was the 2025 State of Digital Government Review, which pointed out that the risk of cyber attacks on government is critical. And given you mentioned local governments, there are also central government departments that hold and process vast amounts of personal and sensitive information. Think, for example, DWP administered £288 billion of benefits over the past year. Over 23 million people claim some sort of benefits from DWP, and in processing and responding to those claims, DWP must have, processed huge amounts of very sensitive medical and financial information on individuals. So we do think it's an omission to leave it out, we'd recommend government to consider bringing it into scope.
Thank you, John.
Just on this question of closer alignment, can you give us a sense on the international picture whether there are certain regulatory regimes which raise the barrier to the terrorist or the criminal so high that they're kind of left alone? Is that a national thing, or is that a company-based thing? Where are the sort of flow lines of attack and threat? Is it on a national basis, or is it on a corporate basis?
I don't think the cyber criminal really cares, to be blunt. They will attack anywhere. Now, you can, of course, on one side...
So sorry, could you possibly speak to the microphone, because I can't hear you, I'm sorry.
Yes, sorry. I was saying that the cyber criminal doesn't care about lines and geographies and standards and whether you've got an international standard or you follow the legislation of that country. They don't care. They will attack where they see the weakest link.
No, I appreciate that. My question was, where does that then lead them to attack? On the basis that they'll take the route of least resistance, yep. Where is that? Is that an international thing, or a national thing, or a corporate thing?
I think it's probably across all three, to be quite honest with you, because the reality is what they're looking to achieve is very dependent on what they want to achieve, whether it's an economic, whether it's a targeted attack at a corporate entity. I don't think it has those boundaries. I genuinely think it's across the whole industry and the whole, almost globally. You know, the reality is cyber attacks everybody. We are being attacked every day. And I think it's just one of those things that I don't see it as being an international boundary. I don't see it's a UK thing or a US thing. I think it's generally across the globe.
Well, other witnesses have anything to say on that?
Happy? Good. Andrew Cooper.
Thank you, Chair. As a question for Jill Broom, you were talking earlier about the incident reporting requirements. What I wanted to ask is, do you think that the legislation as proposed strikes the right balance in terms of encouraging organisations to come forward when they've been attacked, so that sector can learn from that and that vulnerabilities are patched out in other areas, versus it being too stringent, that organisations are concerned about penalties they might face if they're fully transparent?
I think, again, there is something to be said around the devil is in the detail, because a lot of it's coming with the secondary legislation, so we'll learn more about the specifics on incident reporting there as well, and also penalties that will come into play too. And I think there needs to be, again, a sort of balance with those in terms of the risk that's being imposed and also the impact too that happens. And I think within the bill itself there probably needs to be some greater kind of safeguards or kind of reference to frameworks about how those types of decisions will be made.
Thank you. Stuart, you were nodding, which suggested you had something to contribute.
I think it's an interesting cultural challenge, right? You want people to be open and report about incidents that are having an impact, but at the same time, if you then report those incidents, you might get fined. Well, particularly as a small business, they could be quite economically challenging. So the reality is, yes, we want to be open, we want to report incidents, but again, and this is where the detail will come in, what is the level of detail that needs to be reported, and what is the impact of reporting it? Because I think that the reality is, when you then report it to a regulator, what are they going to do with it? How are they going to share it to everybody else? How is it actually going to have a benefit to everybody else So yeah, the devil is definitely in the detail, and it's a cultural change that's required.
Thank you.
Sarah Russell.
Thank you, Chair. Obviously, no one wants to put crippling costs onto business, but cybersecurity does cost money, and there's no way of avoiding that. And we only have to look at the JLR attack to see the scale of the potential impact on our economy when this doesn't work. And the stuff that we're looking at here is only critical national infrastructure. I wondered if you have had any information from business about whether or not and to what extent this is going to promote increased spending on cybersecurity.
I think we can assume it would, because if you're in the supply chain or you come under scope, then you will have certain responsibilities and you are going to have to invest, and that can also be not just in technology but in the skills place as well. And I think it's probably underestimated about how easy it is to do some of that as well. I think it's quite difficult to find the right skilled people, and that applies across, regulators as well as business too. But I think, generally speaking, yes, I think it will be costly, and I think there are things that probably could help in terms of if it's smaller organisations. techUK has called for things in the past like, financial incentives or potentially tax credits to help SMEs, and that could be on a kind of tiered basis and look at those who are, working within the critical national infrastructure supply chain first.
And if I may just expand on that, so we've been consulting our members and the wider community, and we know that 58% of our respondents in the UK say that they still have critical and significant skills needs within their organisations. And 47% of the respondents, or nearly half the respondents, say that actually skills shortages are going to be one of the greatest hurdles in regulatory compliance. This is corroborated by evidence even in the impact assessment that has been done on previous regulations, previous regulatory regime, where I think it was about nearly half of the operators of essential services who were saying that they do not have access to skills in-house to support the regulatory requirements. So just, continuing to have kind of sustained investment in skills development is definitely going to require funding and effort. But I think just taking it a step back, first of all, I think we need to understand what sort of skills and expertise we need to develop in order to ensure that there's a successful implementation of this bill.
Alison Griffiths.
Thank you, Chair. I wanted to return to looking at supply chain risks, and particularly to ask you about the difference between OT and IT, operational technology versus IT, and whether there is sufficient detail in the bill to protect that. So if you have IEDs going across multiple sectors from single suppliers, are we confident that there is sufficient detail about what the regulatory role is in appointing, saying that suppliers should be within scope? Is there more detail that we need to do to put into the bill? Who's best to answer that?
I'm not an expert on the detail, but what I would say is that there is very little detail in the bill currently regarding IT and OT.
Do you think there should be more or not?
I think the devil's always in the detail, so that any more clarity that can be put in the bill is always going to be a good thing.
Do either the other two have anything else?
I think I'll need to come back to you in writing on the specifics of operational technology.
Please feel free to write Secretary to this session if you feel you want to expand on any answers.
Thank you.
Dave Robertson.
Thank you, Chair. It's a bit of a blended question, actually. I think earlier on, Stuart, you were saying that some of the wording in the bill says that only 11% of MSPs are likely to be covered by the legislation. But then in some of the previous answers, we've spoken about kind of skill shortages and where we need to build those skills. So whilst there's obviously I think we would all want to have as many organisations covered as this as possible. Where do we think the line is? Do we think we currently have enough professionals working in this space to be able to deliver this level of compliance across 11% of MSPs? Do we think that the number of people available in the country because it's very specialised work. Do we think the 11% is in about the right ballpark? Do we need to make that wider? Do we need to make it thinner so that we can ensure compliance? Because it's very easy to write a piece of legislation, but if we haven't got the professionals to be able to deliver the level of compliance at the thresholds that we're setting in this place, then that causes potential other issues. So it's just whether you've got a view about whether the 11%, as you mention it, is in about the right ballpark for the number of professionals that we have, or whether it needs to move either way.
And I'm referring to the government's report on MSPs that was done a couple of years ago. I think there's something like 12,500 MSPs in the UK, and of that are in scope of the bill, there is the 11%, which are the medium and large, but they equate for something like 85% of the revenue that MSPs generate in the UK. So it's proportionally, the larger and media organisations will have the skill sets to deliver those requirements to meet the bill. I think as it comes down the supply chain, I think most managed service providers are suitably qualified to deliver, but they won't be in scope of the bill. So certainly in the CNI, in the critical national infrastructure, they won't be in that sort of space. So I think we've got a good industry, and I think most of the MSPs are in that space. But I would just highlight that, of course, MSPs are generally IT companies. Cybersecurity is not an IT problem. It is much bigger than IT. So whilst MSPs can be one end of and it was back to a question that was asked before about why don't companies just do this anyway and be more secure? Well, the reality is they don't generally understand it, they don't understand the risk, they don't have the qualified people, etc., etc. So it goes on, and it's a sort of vicious circle. And a lot of those companies will just go, yeah, I've got an MSP, they deal with that. So it's an interesting challenge, but to your question directly, I think medium and large MSPs won't have an issue.
If I may weigh in on this, please. Just wanted to take a step back and comment on the state of the profession in the UK, because I appreciate that we're having this discussion specifically in relation to the regulated entities, but there's a broader picture. There are parts of the industry that are not in scope. They need to have the right skills as well. We are starting off on a good foundation. I think the work that's been done by industry, academia, professional associations over the past few years has helped to grow the profession steadily. DCIT's report mentions that the number of cybersecurity professionals directly employed in this sector has increased 11% over the past year. That being said, there is more to be done, and I'd really urge the government to think about the skills piece not only in relation to the bill but as a wider challenge. And we're very proud of our 10,000 plus members in the UK who are working very hard day and night to secure their organizations despite all challenges and pressures. But this bill does give government a pivotal opportunity to elevate the status of the profession and to professionalize the sector.
Andrew Cooper.
Thank you. As a question for you, Stuart, as an MSP, you'll be familiar that the large cloud service providers will tend to allow you to live fail over to different regions. You might, by default, you might be hosting in the UK region, but depending on an outage, you might live fail over to the European Union, you might live fail over to the US, depending on the cloud service provider you're using and how it's set up. Yep. In your view, how does the legislation deal with that in terms of allowing you as an MSP to be compliant with it?
So it's about understanding what your service is delivering. And again, one of the key terms in the bill is resilience, right? So needing resilience is going to be a key part of this bill. So whether you need a service that has international boundaries and you need to fail over to another country, that's going to be down to the organisation defining where they want their services to be. So if they're happy that they're failed over into the US, then fine, or in any other country, I'm picking on the US. But the reality is it's going to be really down to the organisation that has a requirement for a resilient service and understanding where their data is. And as long as they understand where their data is and understanding what they're asking of the MSP, I'm not sure the bill's going to cover that as such. I think it's talking about resilience in general. I don't think it's going into the detail of where your data is.
Okay, thank you.
Bradley Thomas.
Thank you, Chair. Do the witnesses have a view on the benchmarks that at the moment appear not to sit behind the scale of incidents that must be reported, and the absence of any benchmarks and the impact that they may have on smaller firms and the risk of over-reporting?
Well, I mean, if I read the designation of a critical supplier, any such distribution that is likely to have a significant impact on the economy or the day-to-day functioning of society in the whole or in any part of the United Kingdom. That's a pretty big statement, and as a small business owner, how do I know if what I do is going to have an economic benefit to the UK? Have an economic benefit to my business, but whether that has a wider impact, that's a big statement, and I'm not sure it's clear enough, to be quite honest with you.
How do you think clarity could be gleaned?
I think it needs a bit more, more detail, and even if it's given some boundaries, so that we have something that we can say, well, if it's going to do the following, what is an impact? What is, to read it again, significant economic impact? Well, I'd like to think any of our services won't have a significant economic impact, but if they affect one single person, then I would be bringing it more onto the citizen and the impact on people. Because if you look at the supply chain, and we've heard it a number of times about the JLR, the impact on the supply chain was huge. I mean, it was very economically costly, and it directly impacted people's lives. So anything that can be put more clarity on what is defined as an impact at that sort of level, I think can only help.
I agree with that as well. I think more clarity needs to be there. The bill should be tighter in terms of defining that sort of systemic risk as well.
And if I may add, the bill as it currently stands requires competent authorities and regulators to designate an organization as a critical supplier rather than the regulated entity. Organizations work with complex multi-tier supply chains, and the concern is that regulated competent authorities that are one step further removed from those complex supply chains and have even less visibility, transparency, and control over those supply chains might find it difficult to determine true criticality and risk within the supply chains. So we ask for greater collaboration and coordination between the regulated entities and the competent authorities in designating an organization as a critical supplier.
Spencer, briefly.
Thank you. So the issue about complexity and how loose things are drafted in this bill comes up quite a few times, and you've given good evidence in terms of your concerns around this. What's the cost that you see to business right now and you anticipate if the bill stays as it is with it so loose and so much left to secondary legislation?
It's probably a broader point around legal certainty that's not given on the face of the bill. There's language there which some of our members have highlighted could create some pretty significant legal jeopardy for regulated entities. So I think the bill needs to kind of go a bit further. It could and should do more to provide some legal certainty, because that the cost could be quite significant on companies. I think just to go back to the point as well around consistency across regulators and things like that too. There needs to be sort of more frameworks around that, how that's going to work. Again, sort of leaving all the detail to the secondary legislation is what sort of makes it slightly difficult to look at what's on the face of the bill. So I think just making sure that everything is consulted on in a mandatory and meaningful way will be important.
Alison Griffiths, did you want to?
Yeah, I'm fine.
Yeah, okay, good, thank you. Well, I'm looking around the table. It seems to me that everybody is satisfied. Thank you very much indeed to Sanjana, Jill and Stuart for giving so freely of your time this morning. I know you're very busy people. Order.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
On time. Well, good morning, everyone. We're now going to hear oral evidence from Matt Houlihan, Vice President for Government Affairs in Europe for Cisco UK and Ireland, Ben Lyons, Senior Director of Policy and Public Affairs for Darktrace, Chris Anley, Chief Scientist for NCC Group, and Dr. Ian Levy, Vice President of Security at Amazon. We must stick to timings in the programme motion that we've already agreed to, and for this session we have until 11:25. Could the witnesses please briefly introduce themselves for the record, starting with Dr. Levy?
Good morning, I'm Ian Levy. I'm a Vice President and Distinguished Engineer at Amazon, and that job allows me to look across everything that Amazon does, including AWS, the bookshop, our new satellite system, and everything in between. Prior to that, I spent 23 years in GCHQ, and I was the founding technical director and designer of the National Cybersecurity Centre.
I'm Chris Anley, Chief Scientist at NCC Group. We're a multinational cybersecurity company listed on the London Stock Exchange and headquartered in Manchester.
Hi everyone, I'm Matt Houlihan. I'm the Vice President for Government Affairs in Europe for Cisco, a technology company specialising in networking, security and collaboration technologies.
Good morning, I'm Ben Lyons. I'm Senior Director for Policy and Public Affairs at Darktrace. We're a company that uses AI for cybersecurity, headquartered up in Cambridge.
Thank you. Shadow Minister first.
Thank you, Chairman, and thanks for coming and speak to us this morning. I've got a different question for each of you, so I'll just rattle them off and then ask you to go through. So starting with Ben from Darktrace, how are developing and emerging technologies such as AI and post-quantum crypto changing the neighbour of cybersecurity threats, and do you think this bill responds adequately to this changing threat landscape? Moving on to Matt from Cisco, what further guidance and consultation from the government and the Information Commission do you think is needed for MSPs to comply effectively with their obligations under this bill? Chris from NCC Group, there's been lots of serious deficiencies in government cyber resilience highlighted by the NAO report last year. Do you think the Cyber Action Plan goes far enough, and how can government departments be overseen in such a way and held to account in such a way to deliver meaningful improvements in cyber resilience? And then finally, Ian from Amazon. Amazon's got extensive exposure to supply chain partners as a core feature of your business model. Do you think the approach of designation of critical suppliers by regulators under this bill is the correct approach? What further consultation do you think might be needed or is needed to make sure this is proportionate and prioritises the most critical suppliers? And crucially, of course, gives some degree of certainty, whether that's legal or financial. Thank you.
So AI is significantly changing cybersecurity. I would think about it at three levels. So firstly, there is the way in which attackers are using AI to mount cyber attacks. Secondly, there is the need to secure AI systems and to secure AI within companies and organisations. And thirdly, there is a question of how AI is changing cybersecurity on the defensive side. So, briefly, we see significant usage of AI by attackers. Just today, actually, we're releasing a survey which shows that amongst security professionals, 73% say that AI-powered threats are having a significant impact on their organisation. That is, often things like phishing, like reconnaissance, and enabling, lowering the barriers to being able to launch an attack and to review more targets more effectively. The CEO of Anthropic, one of the main frontier AI labs, warned last month that he sees AI as potentially being the main, AI-led cyber attacks being the main way in which cyber attacks are conducted in the future. Then at the kind of level of the enterprise, you have a challenge around how do you secure the enterprise, both in terms of developing and deploying AI, but also visibility of AI use within your own organisation. And then, certainly we are seeing, AI transforming how cybersecurity vendors and organisations are deploying or managing the threat in terms of being able to have greater visibility, detecting threats more quickly and the like. In terms of how the bill responds to this, I think one of the things which is positive about this approach is that it's setting out an agile outcomes based approach, which means that it can be capable, the regulatory regime can be capable of evolving as the threat evolves. So I think it is sensible not to be talking about AI in depth on the face of the bill, but through mechanisms like the code of practice, it would be possible for expectations to evolve over time as the threat and as technology matures.
Well, thank you for the question on...
I should say to the witnesses, don't feel obliged to answer each question if you don't feel you have anything material to add, but please, Matt.
It's very tempting to answer the question on AI, but on the question on managed service providers, and thank you for it, look, it's right that managed service providers are looked at in this bill. An increasing amount of the work of managing IT services is clearly now outsourced to managed service providers, and so there needs to be some scrutiny of and some baseline of cybersecurity with those. I would say a couple of things on what guidance is needed. First of all, on the definition in the bill, we're actually broadly supportive of the definition. I appreciate the comments in the previous session that suggested that the definition was a little bit too broad and could be refined, which I think is fair. But when you compare the definition in the CSRB to the definition used of managed service providers in the NIS2 legislation, there's a couple of bits of clarity which are provided in the CSRB about the managed service provider needing to provide an ongoing management of IT systems, and that ongoing word is quite important, we feel. And then secondly, it has to involve connecting to or accessing the network and information systems relied on it by the customer. And that connecting to or accessing the network, again, we feel is an important part of the definition that should be put forward. One of the areas I think that more tightness can be provided is on the face of the bill, there is a non-exhaustive list of activities that an MSP could be involved in. For example, support and maintenance, monitoring, active administration, but then it says all other activities. And I think it's that all other activities which just adds quite a bit of uncertainty in terms of what is and what isn't an MSP. The other area I'd just like to highlight, and maybe linking to Ben's answer on AI, is that the active administration raises a question about to what extent AI-enabled managed services would come under this definition. To what extent, I'm sure lots of managed services providers will be using AI more and more in the services they provide to their end customers, and to what extent active administration also involves an AI-related service. Just on the specific question, and just to end on this, look, the ICO will be issuing guidance, I believe, for managed service providers once the bill is passed. I think with a lot of this guidance, though, that will be the critical thing to get right, and so there should be consultation on it, as my colleague from techUK suggested earlier. I'd also suggest, though, that when we have that guidance, it can't be a simple checkbox of a list of things that have to be done, and we should sort of shift our thinking to having more of an ongoing appreciation of what cybersecurity involves in practice for MSPs or for other regulated entities under the bill. And so making sure it is that ongoing process and there's effective enforcement involved will be important too.
Yes. So on the NAO report, the Cyber Action Plan and public sector cybersecurity, you're absolutely right to point out that the NAO report identifies serious issues. Also, the government recently acknowledged it's likely to miss its 2030 cyber resilience targets. And also, it's important to point out that the Cyber Action Plan lays out an approach with many very positive elements, an additional £210 million in central funding. There are many benefits to this. The centralised provision of services at scale, for example, concentration of expertise, reduction of cost. And then there are other broader initiatives in the Cyber Action Plan, such as, which has been mentioned several times in these sessions, the UK Software Security Code of Practice, which is a voluntary code that can be used as a tool by organisations to secure their supply chain. And both Cisco and NCC Group are ambassadors for that scheme. We voluntarily comply with it. It improves our own resilience. So as to whether it goes far enough, this is a very difficult question. The NAO report also points out the extreme complexity of the situation, and within the budgetary constraints, the steps in the plan seem reasonable, I think it's fair to say. But there is a broader budgetary conversation to be had in this area. Two of the most significant issues identified in the report are the skills shortage, which has come up in these sessions. Almost a third of cybersecurity posts in government are presently unfilled, and that's dangerous. And secondly, departments rely on vulnerable, outdated legacy IT systems, which may be the cause of an incident in their own right and would certainly make an incident much more severe were one to occur. Now, the discussion is, the problem is, that both of those are largely budgetary issues. So successive governments have obviously focused on delivering taxpayer value, as they should, we're all taxpayers, but that's led over a period of a decade or more to a position where departments find it difficult to replace legacy IT systems and difficult to fill these high-skilled, high-cost cybersecurity positions. So there is very much a broader discussion to be had, as has been raised in these sessions before, about where we should be in terms of the budget. But yes, you're absolutely right to raise the issues. Of course, although we're focusing on the bill, which focuses on the private sector, the public sector obviously must lead by example. So.
So on the definition of critical suppliers, we think the current definitions are probably overly broad and risk bringing in SMEs, for example, where you really don't want to. That said, we do need to think about the transitive nature of supply chains. And so we've seen in previous regulations that talk about cybersecurity a flow down of requirements through contracting chains. And there's a real question about how far down is reasonable to go down those contracting chains, because in my experience, the value of the contract and the potential impact are not necessarily correlated. We certainly saw that when we were doing evidence for the Telecom Security Act previously. There is a real question about how you define what supply chain you mean. So you mentioned that Amazon AWS has a complex supply chain. We certainly do. Astoundingly complex. The important thing for us is that we control the really important parts of that. And so, for example, we build our own CPUs, we're building our own GPUs, we build our own servers, we build our own data centers, and so on and so on and so on. The question then becomes, how does that translate out to customers? So if a customer is using a partner's service running on AWS, where does the liability accrue? And that's something that I don't think is covered adequately in the bill today. In terms of certainty and foreseeability, as it stands, the bill admits a single entity being regulated multiple times in multiple different ways. So we are subject today to at least 4 different sets of regulations and regulators. Some of those conflict, some of those are ambiguous, and so as this expands out, we would think that a single reporting regime, a lead regulator model, would seek to bring some of that ambiguity away so that you have more foreseeability and certainty about what you're trying to do. In terms of consultation, There are things in the current drafting of the bill that we think need some consultation. So there are things in primary legislation, for example, the Secretary of State's powers, that seem to be unbounded, is probably the best way to describe it, and that seems dangerous. And we understand the necessity for particular powers around national security, but we think there needs to be some sort of safeguards, some sort of consultation around how those are used in practice. Because certainly for any multinational company, something that is affected in the UK is likely to have effect to all of our customers. And so there's some real constraint needed around that.
Minister.
Thank you, Chair. One of the themes that is already emerging in the conversation and in the wider public debate around this is this kind of one line of thought which says that the law, by focusing on outcomes, principles and responsibilities, and then delegating specificity to both agile definition over time, but also specific expertise in sectors, that's the right framework. And an alternative view which says that in looseness there is uncertainty, we should, in Parliament, be prescribing the activity thresholds, the impact thresholds, and what companies should be doing. I'm interested across the board in areas where you think prescription is a helpful way to go, but also your general experience of the core way and framework in which we have regulated a number of these activities, which is to rely on the agility and expertise in particular sectors rather than the prescription of activity in the face of primary legislation.
Could I step in on that? So, by our calculation, as you say, the number of organisations that fall under the scope of the bill in terms of the impact assessment that was published by the government is 0.1% of the private sector, which is 1/100th of the tip of the iceberg, clearly. So we're going to have to adopt a whole of economy approach if we're going to secure the UK. We already talked about the public sector issues. On the bill itself, we have three main comments. First, the secondary legislation forms the bulk of the technical measures, so we're calling for early consultation on that. Second, the bill imposes additional reporting obligations, adding to an already complicated situation in terms of reporting cyber incidents in the UK. And the reporting obligations trigger at a time of great complexity for an organisation. So we're calling for a single point of contact for reporting all cybersecurity incidents within the UK and a single timeline. Now, that may sound like a big ask, an impossible dream. Australia has already done it, and the EU is in the process of doing it in their digital omnibus streamlining package right now. Finally, in terms of cyber professionals, the passage of a cybersecurity bill through Parliament is a golden opportunity to address the serious problems with the Computer Misuse Act. Cyber professionals who are defending the UK cannot currently do so without risking criminal prosecution. We can't carry out basic identification and verification actions without potentially committing the offence of unauthorised access to computer material, because a ransomware gang, for example, is unlikely to give us authorization to identify their command and control system that they are using to attack the UK. So we support the Cyber Up campaign, which is proposing an amendment to the Computer Misuse Act, providing a statutory defence resting on four strong safeguarding principles. We believe that will help protect our defenders while maintaining the integrity of the law. Based on the campaign's research in terms of the size of the cybersecurity industry in the UK, this amendment would not only help to prevent incidents and mitigate incidents in progress, it would add 9,500 highly skilled jobs and over £2.5 billion in revenue to the UK economy. In terms of other nations are already benefiting from these types of safeguards, including our oldest ally, Portugal, which has implemented them in their recent amendments to NIS2, which is the exact legislative equivalent of the process we're in today. So, in summary, please help us to defend the UK by protecting our defenders, I think.
If I can just follow up on what Chris has said, we strongly agree on early consultation on the secondary legislation with the technical detail. Somebody said it in the previous session, the devil is always in the detail in security. and well-meaning text can be massively misinterpreted. And so we do need to be very careful about that. So wide early consultation is key. On incident reporting, 2 points. Chris's point about when you are being asked to report is when you are most desperate, because you've just found out that you've been attacked, you don't know what's going to happen. A lot of legislation accidentally ignores the victim. And so when we set up the NCSC, one of the primary things was we're there to support the victims, and I urge you not to lose sight of that. Absolutely going after them later, finding the culprits, absolutely, but at that moment in time, the victims are absolutely key to this. The second part of that about a single reporting timeline and a single reporting route is not just good for the victims, it's the only way we generate strategic intelligence. It's one of the things that's missing in the UK and has been for decades. We have 5, 6, 7 different reporting portals that all characterise things differently, take different types of information, and bringing that together to have a single picture about the actual threat to the UK is incredibly difficult. A single reporting forum could fix that.
I might distinguish between what organisations need to do and whether organisations are in scope. I think in terms of what organisations need to do, an outcomes-based approach is sensible, and even if you think about the time when the Johnson government was consulting on measures which would form this bill, that was a time when ChatGPT hadn't been invented, where the geopolitical environment was very different. The world is moving fast, and I think the cyber assessment framework is a good starting place for what a code of practice could look like, because it is already understood by industry and is outcomes driven. I would agree with the previous comments about incident reporting. I think there is a lot of merit in the suggestion around a shared portal so that it is easier to report incidents in that moment of dealing with a cyber attack. And it is, I think within the regime as envisaged, probably the most important bit is about, for incident reporting, is about improving that early clarity for and visibility for the NCSC so that they can help. And that is probably where I place the emphasis more than on the, on regulators having that information within 24 hours. I think in that context, like an approach which recognises best efforts in that first 24 hours, but is focused on tackling the problem, will be important for dealing with the issue. And then finally, I would just say on the supply chain. And we've heard about it before, I think there could be more clarity there in terms of who would be in scope for designated suppliers, and thinking a bit around both systemic dependency and the potential for wider disruption would be important factors to give it more clarity.
Just to, if I may, Chair, just to round off the responses, on the question about finding this balance between specificity and agility. Look, I think the bill does a reasonable job at that, and we can totally see the need for to keep some of the doors open, because not only is the nature of the threat changing rapidly, the nature of technology, and already talked about AI, we have lots of quantum research taking place as well, which will have a big bearing on cybersecurity too, and the nature of our capabilities to defend are changing as well. And so it's right that the bill has some agility in it. But it's clear from the responses today that there's a need to tighten up in certain places. So we talked about incident reporting and certainly having a simpler, more coordinated system for regulated entities to work with, so that that reporting process is easier to work with. The definition of incident itself needs to be looked at, we believe. It's this idea of an incident not only having but capable of having an adverse effect on information systems, which really opens the door very, very widely to lots and lots of incidents, potential incidents, that may need to be reported on. and having more a tighter definition there, I think, would be very useful. And then I want to touch on this point about Secretary of State powers as well, where we feel the door is, a little bit too wide as well. If you look at legislation like Australia's cybersecurity legislation from 2018, the Security of Critical Infrastructure Act, that also has some good Secretary of State powers, but there's lots and lots of guardrails that are contained in that make it clear that it is a power of last resort, where the entity is unwilling or unable to carry out the remedial action itself, and there are other guardrails that are contained in that bill. And we'd urge the committee and we'd urge the government to look at that act and take inspiration from it to think about where those guardrails could be worked into the UK law as well.
Thank you. I've got 4 colleagues wishing to ask questions, and we only have 20 minutes to ask them in, so I would appeal for brevity, both in the questions asked and also, gentlemen, if you don't mind, in the answers given. I'm going to call Bradley Thomas.
Thank you, Chair. 2 questions, if I may. On the topic of cross-border control, how do you think we can get definition around the resilience obligations and how they apply to foreign hosted systems, particularly given that your networks will be quite widespread? And then second question is more broad. Given that you are all responsible for operating networks that are strategically important, yet you've also, your commercial companies, you're operating commercially, how do you think we strike the right balance between growth in AI, proportionate regulation, and not stifling commercial innovation?
I'll start with that one then.
Please, gentlemen, don't feel obliged to answer each question.
On the diverse networks and where they're hosted, I think it's important to be clear that resilience changes as scale changes. So the statistical model used to talk about resilience for a national system, so if you have, say, 3 physical data centres in the UK connected by a redundant ring, that has a well-understood statistical model. As you get bigger and bigger and bigger and more diverse, the statistics change. And so the way you analyse resilience changes. And this isn't AWS specific, this applies to any large-scale system. The way that we talk about resilience needs to be thought through carefully. And I'd urge outcomes. And so talking about availability, talking about resilience to particular events. So somebody drives a JCB into a data center in a national scale resilience model, that can have a big impact. In a hyperscaler, it really doesn't. And so we need to be really clear about what the regulation is trying to do. And so if you look at us as a data center operator, it's very, very different to someone who's providing co-location services. We provide our data centers for the sole purposes of providing our services, which have a very particular resilience model that's very different to somebody sticking their own racks in a third-party data center. And so some of the terms need to be better defined, I think. In terms of balancing growth, regulation, oversight, etc., I think there is a fallacy about putting specific technologies into legislation, except in very specific circumstances. So we've talked about post-quantum cryptography, we've talked about AI. They will affect resiliency, but probably not in the way that we think they will today. And so I would caution about putting specific technology definitions on the face of the bill.
On the cross-border question, very quickly, there's clearly a lot of jurisdictions looking at legislation in this space. I think there is absolutely an opportunity for the UK to look at things like mutual recognition agreements, where that would simplify the international regulatory landscape, but also an opportunity for the UK to lead in this space as a very well-respected and cyber-capable country. I'd also, just touching on the question on getting the balance right on growth and security, we have seen some quite useful moves recently from the UK government and from previous governments on looking at codes of practice, which are voluntary in nature, but actually help engage companies like my own and Chris's in the recent software security code of practice. And so techniques like that, I think, do offer that nice balance and do engage companies, yet get that message around growth absolutely right too.
Dr. Gardner.
Oh, thank you. I have so many questions. I'll limit myself, and I think some of them have been touched on. I was interested in your Cyber Up campaign you mentioned, and so I was interested. What are the measures, both legislative and non-legislative, could the UK government take to enhance the cyber resilience of the UK's critical national infrastructure? And in terms of resilience, is there any requirement to look a little bit deeper at fail-safes and also non-technical fail-safes that we need to do? Because we're always going to get that. And the second question to Ben, in combining AI and cyber, you are combining sort of technology of AI, which comes with its own unique risks, with cyber security. So I'm just quite interested how you mitigate against that. And I was just a bit intrigued, because by AI, I assume you're not talking about straightforward machine learning. So Chris, yes, my first question was directed to yourself.
So in terms of what other things we could do, we talked about voluntary codes, and the value of voluntary codes was questioned in an earlier session. The World Health Organization Best Practice Guide on Hand Washing, which is entirely voluntary, saved millions of lives in the recent pandemic. It's important to bear in mind that codes that help you to protect yourself are definitely valuable. Other actions that are already taking place that we may want to extend on the basis of solid evidence and data, the Cyber Essentials scheme, for example, the various codes of practice, the Cyber Governance Code of Practice for boards was mentioned earlier, along with the government outreach and attempting to get boards to recognise that cyber risk is a business risk and this is an existential threat, and so on. And we talked about the cyber assessment framework and how that is likely to be the scope within which this bill is actually implemented. So I don't think it's necessarily that we need to do something new. The scope of this bill, as we said, is 0.1% of the UK private sector. So there is scope to expand the existing things that we're doing, especially Cyber Essentials, for example, raising the bar for small, medium enterprises across the economy. So yes, I think there's a lot that we are doing, that we could do, that we already have the scope to expand, but obviously that must be done prudently and on the basis of solid evidence.
Thank you. And Ben, are you combining two risks?
I mean, it is something that we think very deeply about. I mean, what we see AI as helping to mitigate some of the risks from cybersecurity in terms of being able to detect attacks more quickly, to understand what might be causing those attacks, and to respond at pace. But we have designed our technology. We're an AI native company, and we've thought deeply about how to ensure that the technology is both secure and responsible. So we are privacy preserving by design. We take our AI to the organisation's environment to build an understanding of what normality looks like for them, rather than vast data lakes of customer data. We take a lot of efforts to ensure that the information surfaced by AI is interpretable to human beings, so that it is uplifting human professionals and enabling them to do more with the time that they've got. And then we're accredited to a range of standards like ISO 27001, ISO 42001, which is a standard for AI management. But we have released a white paper on how we approach responsible AI in cybersecurity, which I'll be happy to share with you and could give it more detail.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you everyone for coming along. And Chris has kind of touched on it already, but in the government's impact assessment of the bill, it said the UK was falling behind its international partners. Obviously, you've all experienced of working globally. I wondered if you could comment on that and whether you agree with it.
Yeah, very, very happy to. Look, I think the two main comparisons that come to mind, one is the EU. We talked quite a bit about NIS2 and the progress that is being made. What I'd say is, NIS2 does take a slightly different approach to the one of the UK government, in that it outlines, I think it's 18 different sectors, up from 7 under NIS1. And so there is that sort of wide scope in terms of NIS2. I would say that although NIS2 is an effective piece of legislation, the implementation of it remains a little bit patchy over the EU. I think something like 19 of the 27 EU member states have implemented NIS2 to date in their national laws, so there's clearly a bit of work still to do there. And there's also some variations, which we feel as an international company operating right across the European Union, there is some variation in terms of how NIS2 is being implemented. And as has been touched on just briefly now as well, that there is now a move through what are called omnibus proposals to simplify the reporting requirements and other elements of cybersecurity and privacy laws across the EU as well, which is a welcome step as well. I mentioned in a previous answer the work that Australia have been doing, and I think that the SOCI, as it's called, the Security of Critical Infrastructure Act from 2018, was genuinely a good standard that has set expectations and set a good bar around the world. It does have quite rigorous reporting requirements in that. It does have those caveats and guardrails for the government step-in powers as well. And it also covers things like ransomware, which we know the UK government, the Home Office, I believe, is looking at, and IoT security as well, which the UK government did look at recently too. So I say that they're probably the two comparators. What we hope is that the CSRB will take the UK in a big step towards that. And but as a lot of my colleagues have said this morning, there's still a lot of work to do in terms of seeing the guidance and making sure it's implemented effectively.
So on that point, where are we perhaps falling behind? So streamlining of reporting, already mentioned, Australia and the EU, that's in progress. Protection of our defenders or their defenders, other territories are already benefiting from those protections. So the EU, the US, I mentioned Portugal specifically. Australia is an interesting one, an additional third and final point. They're providing a cyber safety net to small and medium enterprises, providing cyber expertise by the government to enable smaller entities to get up to code, as it were, and achieve resilience where those entities are not, they lack the personnel, they lack the funding perhaps.
Emily Darlington.
Thank you very much, Chair. And a huge thank you to the panel. In fact, and many of my colleagues have already asked the questions. I appreciate you talking about the future-proofing in quantum, also the international regulatory environment and the use of standards alongside regulation to drive up quality. You all have a huge amount of UK clients. I really wanted to ask you about how that good cyber culture gets embedded. What's the role of what's the role of this regulation within that? And particularly picking up on Ben's point around the security by design point that you have mentioned with your own firm. Do you think that's well understood within your clients within the UK, and how do we get that right balance between what's in the regulation and what should be through a standards model working with BSI and others?
So the previous set of witnesses talked about board responsibility around cybersecurity. In my experience, whether a board is engaged or not is a proxy indicator for whether they're looking at risk management properly. And in my experience, you can't change corporate culture through regulation, not quickly anyway. And so I think there's something around incentives to make sure that companies are really looking at their responsibilities across cybersecurity. And as previous people have said, this is not just a technical thing. One of the things that is difficult to reconcile in my head, and always has been, is trying to levy national security requirements on companies that are not set up to do that. And in this case, I am not talking about AWS, because AWS invests hugely in security. We have a default design principle around making sure the services are secure by design, private by design, and so on and so on. But something to consider for this bill is accidentally putting national security requirements on those entities that cannot possibly meet them. And so we have in the past, as when I was in government, we have in the past accidentally, I will say accidentally, required tiny entities that could not possibly do so to defend themselves against the Russians in cyberspace. And if you try and translate that to any other domain, you say, you, a 10-person company, should defend yourself against Russian missiles. It's insane. And yet we do it in cyberspace. And so part of the flow-down requirements that we see for contracting when you get a bill like this ends up putting those national security requirements on inappropriate entities. And I really think we need to be careful how we manage that.
Can I just make two very quick points?
Very briefly, yes, please.
First of all, the scale of the challenge. Cisco's own research, we released a cybersecurity readiness index, which was a survey of 8,000 companies around the world, including in the UK, and we kind of graded companies by their maturity in terms of cyber. In the UK, it was 8% of companies, these are large companies, were in that mature bracket, which shows just the scale of the challenge. The other point I wanted to make was around, this is a cybersecurity and resilience bill. And I think the resilience bit is really important, and we need to focus on what that means in practice, because there's lots of cyber measures that we need to put in place, but actually resilience is about the robustness of the technology you're using, as well as the cybersecurity measures and the people and everything else that goes with it. So things like looking at legacy technology, for example, obsolete technology that is more at risk, should fall part, I think, of the standards and maybe the regulatory guidance that we see coming through as well. I know the government released it, public sector is not part of the bill, but just to highlight the challenge, DCIT published a report over a year ago now which showed that I think 28% of government systems were in that legacy, unsupported, obsolete bracket, which just highlights the nature of the challenge in this space.
Thank you. Alison Griffiths.
Thank you, Chair. Two specific questions. The first around OT versus IT. Do you think OT and its supply chains are sufficiently covered within this legislation? And secondly, particularly given your commercial organisations, from your direct client experience, what would you say is going to be the thing that will actually move the dial on board governance around cyber specifically?
On the OT versus IT thing, we've mentioned specificity versus flexibility. The benefit of the UK's sectoral regulator model is that regulators who are in areas where OT is, predominant can set specific measures that can reinforce those environments. Whereas if you try a one-size-fits-all approach, you run the risk of certain critical OT-based systems becoming subject to successful attacks.
I might just add to that. I think the broad approach that the UK is taking is sensible, in that the existing guidance does have a range of proposals around OT as well as IT security. Manufacturing is not in scope of this legislation, which I think is probably appropriate, but I think it is worth looking at what could be done to improve the security of the manufacturing sector more broadly, probably through non-legislative means. But in light of recent attacks, there is important in ensuring that guidance and incentives are supporting that sector.
Thank you. Freddie Van Merlo for the last question.
Thank you, Chair. I'm just really interested to pick up on some of the points made by, I think, Matt and Ian around how complex the businesses are that you're part of. Who ultimately do you think is responsible for understanding that? We, in this House and in Parliament, are responsible for looking at UK security, and we only can have control over that. Do you think it's the responsibility of government and Parliament to understand and look at how complex your businesses are, or is it the responsibility of those businesses to comply with the legislation of the countries they want to operate in?
We had an incident back in October last year that had quite a widespread impact. We have engaged with regulators around the world, including multiple regulators in the UK, to explain what happened. We published quite transparently what had happened during the incident and afterwards, explaining how that the part of the organisation that built that particular system works is very, very time-consuming. It's also almost certainly out of date by the time we finished. In that particular case, it was something called a race condition, which is a well-understood computer science hard problem. No amount of regulation or legislation would have made a difference because it's a race condition. They're incredibly hard to find in software. I think regulating outcomes is the right answer. Making sure that we're doing due diligence, making sure that our view of appropriate risk management is broadly the same as yours, without going into this, making us a national security entity. I think that's the challenge. How we run our business is kind of not really relevant. It's the outcomes that matter.
I would say that, look, I think it's increasingly important that businesses and parliamentarians and government officials work together on these issues because, as we said earlier, the pace of change in terms of the technology and indeed in terms of the business environment, both at a UK but also global level, is moving very, very quickly. And so having that exchange of information is going to be important. Look, I think it's important that regulation is clearly, from an international business point of view, as aligned as practicable with other jurisdictions that a lot of the companies here will be working with. And that's not only going to benefit companies that are headquartered elsewhere and operate in the UK, but also UK headquarters looking to expand abroad as well. It's also got to be proportionate and targeted as well. But yeah, look, I think the nub of your question is there is clearly a need for that strong cooperation and sharing of expertise and experiences that is required going forward.
Order. Thank you very much indeed, gentlemen. We have to cut it off there because it's 11:25 and this committee now stands adjourned. Thank you very much indeed for sparing time from your busy schedules this morning. It's much appreciated.